In the winter of 1879, two educated men walked into the Ozark Mountains and vanished without a trace. What happened to the Hargrove brothers wasn't recorded in any official history. It was buried, deliberately, by people who understood that some secrets are too dangerous to survive. Tonight, you're going to learn what they died knowing, and why powerful forces have spent over a century making sure this story stayed hidden. The moment Thomas and William Hargrove stepped off that stagecoach in Eminence, Missouri, they crossed an invisible line. They entered a world where different rules applied, where outsiders who saw too much simply disappeared, and where the winter hunger demanded payment in blood. What I'm about to tell you isn't just history. It's a revelation about the kind of darkness that thrives in isolation, the type of evil that wears the mask of hospitality while sharpening its knives. You think you know what happened to missing persons in the wilderness? You've been told comfortable lies about getting lost, about accidents, about the dangers of nature. But the real predators in those mountains walked on two legs, spoke in familiar accents, and invited travelers to dinner knowing full well they'd never leave. The Hargrove brothers discovered something in those hollows that certain families had been protecting for generations, something that transformed survival into systematic predation, necessity into ritual murder. This isn't a ghost story or local folklore. This is documented evil, carefully hidden by people who understood that exposure meant the end of their way of life. For 145 years, they've succeeded in keeping this buried. Tonight, that changes. You're about to descend into a rabbit hole that leads to one of the darkest chapters in American history. A story of how isolation breeds monsters, and how those monsters learn to feed. Thomas Hargrove as 32, a Civil War cartographer with a methodical mind and careful nature. William was 28, a former seminary student turned geologist, eager and ambitious. Both were educated men from a prosperous Springfield family, the kind of people who believed knowledge and preparation could overcome any obstacle. They were wrong, dead wrong. Their father, Judge Edmund Hargrove, was a powerful figure in Missouri politics, a Union sympathizer who'd gained his position after Confederate judges were removed from office. This detail seems insignificant until you understand the festering hatred that still burned in the Ozark Hollows 14 years after the war ended. The brothers weren't just outsiders. They were the sons of a Yankee judge, walking into territory where old grudges died hard, and justice was administered at the end of a rope. The winter of 1879 was unusually brutal. Temperatures averaged 12 degrees Fahrenheit, with snowfalls exceeding 8 inches. Any sensible person would have postponed geological surveys until spring, but the Hargrove brothers chose this time deliberately, believing reduced foliage would provide better visibility of rock formations. They had no idea they'd also have better visibility of things that were meant to stay hidden. Their letters reveal a secondary mission, assessing mineral deposits for potential mining operations. Thomas wrote to his father about opportunities that our Eastern associates would find most promising, and materials of considerable industrial value. They weren't just scientists, they were advanced scouts for mining interests, a role that made them mortal enemies to families who'd killed to protect their land from outside exploitation. On January 12, 1879, the brothers loaded a stagecoach in Springfield with supplies for a month-long expedition. Stagecoach driver Elijah Morton later described William as particularly eager, while Thomas appeared more reserved, checking and rechecking their supplies as though anticipating difficulties. Thomas's instincts were screaming warnings his educated mind dismissed. He should have listened. Morton dropped them in Eminence, where they planned to proceed on foot into the remote Shannon County region. He was the last person outside the mountains to see them alive. His official statement, filed months later, contained an ominous detail. The brothers had mentioned visiting caves described by local hunters, though Morton couldn't recall specific locations. Those caves would become their tomb. The Ozarks of 1879 weren't just isolated, they were deliberately hidden from outside authority. Homesteads could be separated by miles of dense forest, connected only by paths known to locals. Many families had lived in the same hollows for generations, developing customs that would horrify civilized society. The Civil War had ended, but its hatreds festered in these remote places where grudges were inherited like family heirlooms. Into this world walked two university-educated brothers representing everything the Hollow folk despised: outside authority, government connections, and the kind of progress that threatened their way of life. The Hargroves carried surveying equipment and notebooks, tools of documentation that could expose secrets these families had killed to protect. They might as well have painted targets on their backs. Local families claimed to remember meeting the brothers, but their stories contradicted each other in impossible ways. The Turners said they hosted them for one night. The Holloways initially denied seeing them, then changed their story when evidence suggested otherwise. The Reeds maintained complete ignorance, despite clear signs that someone had explored caves on their property, caves that were mysteriously collapsed with explosives before investigators could examine them. This wasn't confusion or faulty memory. This was coordinated deception, the kind of community-wide conspiracy that only emerges when everyone has something to hide. These families had practiced lying to authorities, experience in making people disappear without leaving traces. The Hargrove brothers weren't their first victims. They were simply the most well-connected, the ones whose disappearance would eventually draw unwanted attention. Deputy U.S. Marshal James Woodson noted the unusual reticence of local residents in his preliminary report. When pressed, accounts are vague and often contradictory. Several individuals who initially acknowledged meeting the brothers later recanted their statements without explanation. This wasn't mountain caution towards strangers. This was fear, the kind of bone-deep terror that keeps entire communities silent about atrocities they've witnessed or participated in. The official investigation concluded the brothers likely became disoriented and died of exposure. No bodies were recovered. Case closed in 1880. But that wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a cover-up that would span generations, involving local law enforcement, state officials, and anyone with enough influence to make inconvenient questions disappear. Thomas Hargrove kept a detailed journal throughout their expedition. The entries that survived paint a picture of mounting dread as two educated men realized they'd walked into something far more dangerous than wilderness. The journal begins normally: weather observations, geological notes, encounters with wildlife. Then, everything changes. January 20th. Strange lights on ridge to north. W wishes to investigate. I disagree. Already, Thomas sensed something wrong while William remained obliviously eager. The lights weren't campfires or natural phenomena. They were signals, communications between homesteads about the strangers in their territory. Janusz, January 21st, met J.H. at Creek Crossing, invited to shelter at his homestead, due to approaching storm. W eager to accept. Something in J.H.'s manner unsettles me. The initials J.H. referred to Jeremiah Holloway, whose property would become their prison. Thomas's instincts were screaming warnings, but William's excitement about potential discoveries overrode his brother's caution. The journal entries from their stay at the Holloway homestead reveal a family that wasn't quite right. Meals taken in near silence, constant watching, sons departing with rifles at midnight, claiming to hunt despite storm and darkness. The daughter's cryptic warning, "You shouldn't have come here. No one leaves the Hollow once they've seen." By January 28th, Thomas was desperate to leave, but William refused. He'd been shown mineral samples, unlike any I've seen, and claimed they'd discovered deposits of incalculable value. He spent entire days with Jeremiah Holloway and his sons, discussing what he believed were negotiations for mining rights. Thomas saw it differently. His brother was being manipulated, drawn deeper into a web that would destroy them both. February 1st brought physical altercation between the brothers. William became enraged when Thomas suggested leaving, behavior Thomas had never known him to exhibit. The younger brother was changing, becoming something else under the Holloway's influence. Thomas noted unusual scars on J.H.'s forearms during dinner, ritualistic pattern. Other family members keep arms covered despite heat from fireplace. The final entry, February 2nd, contains just 4 words that reveal everything. They are not who they claim. Thomas had discovered the truth about the Holloway family, understood what kind of people they really were. The journal ends abruptly, as though the writer was interrupted mid-sentence. He never wrote again. What did Thomas Hargrove discover in those final hours that filled him with such terror? The answer lies in understanding what the Holloway family really was. Not simple homesteaders struggling to survive, but something far more sinister that had been operating in those hollows for decades. County records reveal disturbing patterns around the Holloway property. Between 1870 and 1890, at least 7 travelers were reported missing in the region. All disappeared during winter months. All were outsiders with no local connections. All were last seen near certain properties, including the Holloway homestead. None of these cases were solved, dismissed by authorities as hazards of frontier travel. More telling were the livestock reports. While neighboring homesteads suffered constant theft from rustlers, the Holloways and their allies never reported losses. A Texas county rancher complained in 1882, "The Holloway and Reed properties never suffer losses despite having the fattest stock come spring." A man might wonder what arrangement protects them when all their neighbors suffer. The arrangement wasn't supernatural protection, it was systematic predation on human prey. These families had developed what anthropologist Michael Garfield termed deviant subsistence strategies, using isolated locations and community cooperation to hunt the most dangerous game of all. They'd transformed murder into a survival system, ritual killing into a way of life. Tax records show these properties maintained unusually prosperous households despite poor farming conditions and limited visible means of support. They weren't prospering through agriculture or legitimate trade. They were feeding off travelers who vanished without trace, taking everything these victims carried, and ensuring no one survived to report what they'd seen. The mineral samples that so excited William Hargrove were likely real, but they served as bait rather than genuine opportunity. The Holloway misunderstood that educated men like the brothers couldn't resist the promise of wealth, that greed would overcome caution and keep them in the hollow long enough to become prey. They'd used this strategy before, and they'd use it again. What Thomas finally understood in those last terrifying hours was that his brother had been chosen as the next victim. The negotiations William believed he was conducting were actually preparations for his own slaughter. The family that had welcomed them with apparent hospitality was planning their deaths with the methodical precision of experienced killers. The truth about what happened to the Hargrove brothers began emerging decades later through fragments and confessions, each piece revealing a more horrific picture. In 1907, 28 years after the disappearance, a dying man named Ezekiel Collins made a confession that would haunt anyone who heard it. Collins had been a young hired hand working for several Shannon County families in 1879, including the Holloways. As death approached, guilt finally overcame fear, and he told Methodist minister Reverend Joseph Miller what he'd witnessed that winter. His confession, recorded in church documents, described not just murder, but something far more disturbing: systematic butchery performed with ritual precision. According to Collins, the Hargrove brothers had discovered something during their stay with the Holloways, something that certain local families believed needed to remain hidden. He spoke vaguely of ways of the Hollow people and practices from the old country that Christian men wouldn't abide. These weren't random killings motivated by robbery or land disputes. They were part of an established system, a tradition passed down through generations. Collins described how William Hargrove's excitement about mineral deposits threatened certain arrangements among local families. A meeting of local patriarchs, including representatives from the Holloway, Reed, and Turner families, determined that the brothers had seen too much and could not be permitted to return to Springfield with their knowledge. This was community-sanctioned murder, involving multiple families in a conspiracy of violence. The confession becomes truly disturbing when Collins describes the methodology. The brothers were separated, with Thomas being taken to what he called the prepared place, while William was forced to watch. Collins spoke of a ritual that served dual purposes: to silence those who had seen too much, and to feed what waits below. When pressed for clarification, he responded, "Not monsters like preachers tell of, just men who found something in the deep places and made their bargain with it." Collins claimed the ritual had been practiced in certain hollows since before his birth, suggesting this wasn't isolated madness, but inherited tradition. He described how victims were processed, with certain parts kept for the cellar, while remaining remains were buried in separate locations to prevent identification. The Hargrove brothers weren't victims of desperate people driven to cannibalism by starvation. They were prey in a system that had operated for generations. Most chilling was Collins's reference to others before and since, implying the Hargroves were neither the first nor the last to disappear under similar circumstances. This wasn't an isolated incident born of opportunity. It was part of an ongoing operation that had been claiming lives for decades. Reverend Miller, who recorded Collins's confession, tried to bring this information to authorities. The response he received reveals how deep the conspiracy reached, and how many people had vested interests in keeping these secrets buried. Sheriff Hammond not only dismissed the confession as ramblings of a dying man, but threatened Miller when he persisted in seeking justice. Miller's written account includes this disturbing exchange. "When I pressed the matter, suggestors, an examination of the Holloway property might be warranted, he responded with unexpected hostility. He, particular care, and are absent from the recovered remains. The selective nature of these absences suggests purposeful retention of these specific elements rather than random scavenging or decomposition. These weren't trophies. They were ingredients, kept for purposes that civilized minds prefer not to contemplate." Dr. Simmons concluded his report with a personal observation that speaks to the uniquely disturbing nature of the case. "In 27 years of forensic practice, I have never encountered remains processed in this precise manner. The methodology suggests ritual purpose rather than mere disposal of murder victims." The Hargrove brothers had died in a ceremony that combined execution, butchery, and consumption into a single horrific act. For 3 weeks, it appeared justice might finally be served. The evidence was overwhelming, the methodology clearly established, the location consistent with historical accounts. Then, abruptly, the investigation was terminated. The remains were removed to the state medical examiner's office and disappeared into bureaucratic limbo, never to be seen again. "At this point, I need you to do something. If you've followed me this far down the rabbit hole, if you understand that what you're learning changes everything about how you see history and human nature, I want you to comment below with these exact words: the hollow knows. Type it exactly as I've said it. The hollow knows. This isn't just engagement. It's acknowledgement. It's you accepting that you've crossed a line, that you're now part of the community of people who understand that official history is a carefully constructed lie designed to hide truths that would shatter comfortable illusions about civilization and human nature. Comment, the hollow knows. If you're ready to go deeper, if you want to understand not just what happened to the Hargrove brothers, but how systems of organized evil operate and protect themselves. This phrase will mark you as someone who's seen behind the curtain, who's willing to confront the darkness that exists in the spaces between official records and sanitized histories. The investigation into the Hargrove remains was terminated not through oversight or bureaucratic incompetence, but through deliberate intervention by people with connections reaching the highest levels of state government. A handwritten note attached to the termination memo, discovered years later, reveals the real reason. Holloway nephew now in office in Jefferson City. Old connections still matter. This wasn't ancient history anymore. It was active conspiracy involving living people who had inherited both the secrets and the power to protect them. The same families that had butchered the Hargrove brothers in 1879 were still operating in 1952, still wielding influence, still making inconvenient evidence disappear. They'd evolved from backwoods killers into respectable citizens, but their fundamental nature remained unchanged. The construction continued as planned. No marker indicates what was found there. No mention of the Hargrove brothers appears in local histories published after 1952. When University of Missouri researchers attempted to locate the remains in 1968, they were informed that the evidence had been misplaced during office reorganization. Official amnesia had been imposed, backed by the same power that had protected these families for nearly a century. But power can't erase everything. Fragments continue to surface, suggesting the story refuses to stay buried completely. In 1957, church renovation workers discovered a metal box concealed within a wall cavity, containing a page from William Hargrove's field notebook. The final entry read, "Holloway assures private viewing of main cavity tomorrow. Fortune awaits if deposit as extensive as preliminary samples suggest." William had died believing he was about to become wealthy. Instead, he'd become dinner. The cruel irony wasn't accidental. It was part of the psychological torture these families inflicted on their victims, allowing them hope right until the moment the knives came out. The pastor who found William's notebook page tried to return it to Hargrove family descendants. Sheriff Wilson advised him to leave old business buried and warned that further discussion of the matter would be unwelcome. When the pastor persisted, he was told the materials would be confiscated as evidence and that he should forget the matter entirely. The threat was clear: shut up or join the brothers. This pattern repeats throughout the historical record. Anyone who gets too close to the truth faces intimidation, threats, or worse. Michael Garfield, the anthropology student who tried to document the pattern of disappearances in 1963, withdrew from his program after receiving anonymous threats. His research materials were destroyed in a department storage fire. His faculty advisor noted that Garfield had touched on sensitive matters that certain regional interests preferred remain unexplored. Dr. Eleanor Westcott, Garfield's advisor, provided insight into why this case remained so dangerous. There are practices that occurred in isolated communities during desperate times that modern sensibilities prefer not to acknowledge. Michael found evidence suggesting such practices became systematized in certain hollows, continuing long after necessity might have justified them. The implication is clear. What happened to the Hargrove brothers wasn't an isolated incident, but part of ongoing operations. The power protecting these secrets isn't just local anymore. It's institutional, reaching into universities, law enforcement, and state government. The same families that practiced ritual murder in 1879 have spent generations positioning descendants in positions where they can control information and eliminate threats. They've evolved from crude, backwoods killers into sophisticated operators who understand that controlling narrative is more effective than crude violence. But their fundamental nature hasn't changed. They're still predators, still operating systems designed to identify and eliminate threats to their power. The methods have become more subtle. Academic careers destroyed, evidence misplaced, researchers discouraged through institutional pressure. But the intent remains the same: silence the truth-tellers before they can expose what really happened in those hollows. The Hargrove case represents something larger than two men who disappeared in 1879. It's a window into how organized evil operates, how it protects itself, and how it evolves over time while maintaining its essential character. These families didn't stop being killers. They just learned to kill differently, using systems and institutions instead of knives and saws. Understanding this case means understanding that the comfortable myths about civilization and progress are lies designed to hide ongoing operations by people who've never stopped being monsters. They've just learned to wear better masks and use more sophisticated methods to protect their secrets. The deeper truth about the Hargrove case connects to broader patterns of institutional evil that most people refuse to acknowledge. What happened in those Ozark hollows wasn't aberration. It was revelation of systems that exist wherever isolation provides cover and power protects predators. The same dynamics that allowed families to butcher travelers in 1879 operate today in different forms, but with identical purposes. Consider how quickly evidence disappeared whenever investigators got close to the truth. The remains found in 1952 vanished into bureaucratic limbo. Garfield's reses, Church materials were destroyed by fire. Church records containing Collins's confession were buried in archives. This isn't coincidence. It's systematic suppression by people who understand that certain truths must never reach public consciousness. The families involved weren't isolated psychopaths operating independently. They were part of networks that included law enforcement, government officials, and institutional leaders. The handwritten note referencing Holloway nephew now in office in Jefferson City reveals how these networks perpetuate themselves across generations. Power protects power, and evil protects evil, regardless of time or circumstance. Modern researchers have identified similar patterns in other isolated communities where disappearances cluster around certain properties and families. The methodology varies. Some use accidents, others use suicides, still others simply make people vanish completely. But the underlying system remains consistent. Identify isolated individuals with limited connections, lure them to remote locations, eliminate them systematically, cover up evidence through institutional capture. The Hargrove brothers represented everything these systems fear: educated outsiders with powerful connections and legitimate reasons to document what they found. They couldn't be dismissed as drifters or transients whose disappearance would go unnoticed. Their investigation required more sophisticated suppression, involving multiple levels of authority and decades of careful narrative control. What makes this case particularly revealing is how long the cover-up lasted and how many people participated in maintaining it. From local sheriffs to state officials to university administrators, the conspiracy required cooperation across institutions and generations. This suggests the existence of networks specifically designed to protect certain types of secrets, networks that remain active and dangerous today. The real lesson of the Hargrove case isn't just what happened to two men in 1879. It's how organized evil operates in plain sight, how it recruits institutional protection, and how it eliminates threats to its continued existence. Understanding this case means understanding that similar operations continue today, protected by the same types of networks that buried the truth about what happened in those Ozark hollows. The psychological profile of the families involved reveals something more disturbing than simple criminal behavior. These weren't desperate people driven to violence by starvation or circumstance. They were organized predators who had systematized murder into a way of life, transforming necessity into ritual and creating cultural traditions around the consumption of human prey. Collins's confession referenced practices from the old country and ways of the Hollow people, suggesting these families had imported European traditions related to cannibalism during famine conditions. But what arrived as survival strategy had evolved into something far more sinister: systematic predation that continued long after any justification of necessity had passed. The ritualistic aspects described in the forensic reports indicate these killings served psychological needs beyond simple elimination of threats. The precision of the dismemberment, the ceremonial positioning during execution, the selective retention of specific bones, all point to practices designed to satisfy deep psychological compulsions rather than practical requirements for disposal or concealment. Dr. Westcott's research notes, partially recovered before their destruction, contained references to cultural memories of survival strategies transmitted through generations and ritualized predation justified through belief systems that designated outsiders as acceptable sources of sustenance. These families had developed ideological frameworks that not only permitted but sanctified the murder and consumption of strangers. The multi-generational nature of the conspiracy suggests successful transmission of these belief systems across family lines. Children raised in environments where ritual murder was normal became adults who perpetuated the same practices. The psychological conditioning required to maintain such systems across decades indicates sophisticated methods of indoctrination and control. Most disturbing is evidence that these practices became self-reinforcing rather than diminishing over time. The families involved weren't gradually abandoning their traditions, they were refining them. developing better methods for identification of suitable prey, more efficient systems for elimination and disposal, and more sophisticated networks for protection against investigation. The evolution from crude backwoods killers to institutionally protected operators demonstrates remarkable adaptability. These families learned to leverage legitimate power structures rather than operating entirely outside them. They discovered that controlling sheriffs was more effective than avoiding them, that placing relatives in government positions provided better protection than hiding in hollows. This psychological profile reveals something crucial about the nature of evil itself. Given proper conditions, isolation, community support, ideological justification, humans can systematize the most horrific behaviors and transmit them across generations as normal cultural practices. The Hargrove case represents not just historical curiosity, but warning about humanity's capacity for organized monstrosity when proper constraints are removed. The geographical aspects of this case reveal how terrain itself becomes complicit in systematic predation. The Ozark Mountains provided perfect conditions for the type of operations these families conducted. Isolated hollows accessible only through known paths, cave systems suitable for disposal of evidence, and distances between homesteads that ensured privacy for whatever activities occurred on individual properties. The brothers' geological expertise made them particularly dangerous to these operations. Their systematic documentation of cave systems and mineral formations would have created detailed maps of areas these families preferred to keep secret. The main cavity mentioned in William's final notebook entry likely referred to locations used for disposal of previous victims, places that geological surveys would inevitably discover and document. County records show that certain properties consistently avoided official scrutiny, despite being located in areas where disappearances clustered. Tax assessments remained artificially low, keeping government attention minimal. Road construction projects consistently routed around rather than through specific holdings. Law enforcement responses to complaints involving these properties followed patterns of minimal investigation and rapid case closure. The cave systems that so interested the Hargrove brothers served multiple purposes in these operations. They provided natural refrigeration for storage of human remains, protected disposal sites from scavenging animals, and created acoustic isolation that prevented sounds from carrying to neighboring properties. The deliberate collapse of cave entrances found during the 1879 investigation wasn't about protecting livestock. It was about concealing evidence. Water sources in the region follow patterns that would have been well known to local families, but unfamiliar to outsiders. Travelers following obvious watercourses would inevitably pass through territories controlled by specific homesteads, making them predictable prey for families who understood these geographical constraints. The Hargrove brothers, despite their education and preparation, fell into this same trap. The seasonal timing of disappearances wasn't coincidental. Winter months provided natural explanation for deaths attributed to exposure, while simultaneously creating conditions where bodies would be naturally preserved until spring disposal became practical. The harsh weather also limited travel by potential witnesses and restricted the ability of outside authorities to conduct thorough investigations. Modern analysis of historical weather patterns, water sources, and topographical features confirms that the locations where travelers disappeared weren't random. They represent carefully selected killing zones where geographical advantages could be leveraged to ensure victim isolation and evidence concealment. The families involved had spent generations learning to use terrain as a weapon against their prey. The institutional capture that protected these operations reveals how organized evil embeds itself within legitimate power structures. The Hargrove case demonstrates that successful long-term criminal enterprises require more than just avoiding law enforcement. They require controlling it, along with other institutions capable of investigation or exposure. Sheriff Hammond's hostile response to Reverend Miller's inquiries wasn't unusual for the period. Local law enforcement in isolated regions often developed symbiotic relationships with prominent families, trading protection for political support and economic benefit. The sheriff's threat that Miller's continued presence in the county might become problematic reveals how thoroughly these arrangements could corrupt official authority. The pattern of evidence disappearance remains misplaced during office reorganization, research materials destroyed in convenient fires, documents buried in archives, indicates systematic suppression by people with institutional access and authority. This wasn't casual negligence, but deliberate action by individuals positioned to control information flow and eliminate inconvenient discoveries. University of Missouri records show how academic research into sensitive topics faced institutional resistance. Garfield's funding withdrawal, his advisors' warnings about sensitive matters, and the subsequent destruction of his materials demonstrate how higher education institutions could be leveraged to suppress inconvenient research. The same networks that protected local operations extended into state universities. Government involvement becomes clear through the 1952 termination order referencing the Holloway nephew now in office in Jefferson City. This wasn't just local corruption, but state-level protection extending to the highest levels of Missouri government. The note that old connections still matter suggests these networks maintained power across multiple generations through careful placement of family members in key positions. The legal system's role in the cover-up extended beyond simple case closure. Court records that might have contained relevant information were often sealed, misfiled, or destroyed during routine records management procedures. Legal challenges to these actions faced hostile judges who understood which interests required protection and which could be safely ignored. Religious institutions weren't immune to this corruption. Churches that might have provided moral authority to challenge these operations were either co-opted through intimidation or simply ignored when they raised inconvenient questions. Reverend Miller's experience demonstrates how religious leaders who threatened established arrangements could be silenced through both official and unofficial pressure. The sophistication of this institutional capture suggests coordination and planning that went far beyond local arrangements. These families had created networks specifically designed to identify, infiltrate, and control institutions capable of threatening their operations, ensuring that evidence would disappear and investigators would be discouraged long before reaching dangerous conclusions. The psychological warfare employed against investigators reveals sophisticated understanding of how to neutralize threats without resorting to crude violence. The families involved had learned that destroying careers was more effective than creating martyrs, that institutional pressure worked better than direct confrontation, and that subtle intimidation could be more powerful than obvious threats. Garfield's experience demonstrates this methodology perfectly. Rather than being directly threatened or attacked, he faced funding withdrawal, institutional pressure, and anonymous warnings that created conditions where continuing his research became impossible. His advisor's recommendation to distance himself from the project for his own safety shows how academic institutions could be used to eliminate inconvenient research through seemingly legitimate administrative actions. The destruction of evidence followed similar patterns of plausible deniability. Research materials weren't stolen, they were destroyed in convenient accidents. Documents weren't hidden, they were misfiled during routine reorganizations. Remains weren't concealed, they were lost due to administrative incompetence. Each individual incident could be dismissed as unfortunate coincidence, but the pattern reveals deliberate systematic suppression. Church records containing Collins's confession demonstrate how religious institutions could be neutralized through selective application of authority. Rather than suppressing the confession directly, officials simply buried it in archives where it would remain forgotten unless specifically sought. The document existed, satisfying legal requirements for evidence preservation, but remained effectively inaccessible to anyone who might use it to pursue justice. The timing of accidents and coincidences shows careful monitoring of potential threats. Garfield's research materials were destroyed shortly after he began focusing on specific families and properties. The church renovation that uncovered William Hargrove's notebook page occurred decades after the original disappearance, but the materials were quickly confiscated when they surfaced. This suggests ongoing surveillance of any activities that might threaten established narratives. The multi-generational nature of these operations required sophisticated indoctrination and control mechanisms within the families themselves. Children had to be raised understanding which secrets required absolute protection, which authorities could be trusted, and which methods should be used to eliminate threats. This level of psychological conditioning indicates systematic programming that went far beyond simple criminal training. The evolution from crude frontier violence to sophisticated institutional manipulation shows remarkable adaptability. As direct murder became more difficult due to improved communications and law enforcement, these families learned to achieve the same objectives through corruption, intimidation, and systematic suppression of evidence. They became more dangerous over time, not less. The broader implications of the Hargrove case extend far beyond a single historical incident in rural Missouri. This case provides a template for understanding how organized evil operates in any society where isolation provides opportunity and corruption provides protection. The same dynamics that enabled ritual murder in 1879 continue today in different forms, but with identical underlying structures. Modern missing persons cases in isolated areas often families, investigations that face unusual resistance from local authorities, evidence that disappears through administrative mistakes, and witnesses who change their testimony or refuse to cooperate entirely. The methodology has evolved, but the essential system remains unchanged. The institutional capture demonstrated in this case reveals how criminal enterprises can achieve legitimacy through careful infiltration of power structures. When family members occupy positions in law enforcement, government, academia, and religious institutions, suppressing inconvenient evidence becomes routine administrative procedure rather than obvious criminal activity. The corruption becomes invisible because it operates through legitimate channels. The psychological conditioning required to maintain these operations across generations indicates sophisticated understanding of human behavior modification. Children raised in environments where systematic murder is normalized develop adult personalities capable of perpetuating the same practices while maintaining facades of respectability. This suggests transmission of trauma-based programming that creates functional psychopaths who can operate effectively within mainstream society. The geographical factors that enabled these historical operations remain relevant today. Isolated communities still provide cover for activities that would be impossible in more connected areas. Modern transportation and communication have reduced but not eliminated the advantages of terrain-based predation. Contemporary missing persons cases in rural areas often involve similar geographical patterns, suggesting ongoing operations by groups that understand how to leverage isolation against their prey. The cover-up mechanisms revealed in this case demonstrate techniques that remain effective for suppressing inconvenient truths. Academic research can still be terminated through funding manipulation. Evidence can still disappear through administrative errors. Investigators can still face career destruction rather than direct threats. The methods have been refined, but the objectives remain identical. Most importantly, this case reveals how ordinary institutions can be corrupted to serve extraordinary evil. Universities, law enforcement agencies, government offices, and religious organizations all participated in suppressing evidence and protecting perpetrators. This institutional flexibility suggests that similar corruption could emerge anywhere conditions permit organized predation to establish itself. The ultimate lesson of the Hargrove case isn't just about what happened to two men in 1879, but about the nature of evil itself and how it adapts to survive in changing circumstances. The families that butchered travelers in isolated hollows evolved into respectable citizens who wield institutional power to achieve the same objectives through different methods. They prove that evil doesn't disappear, it just learns better disguises. Understanding this case requires accepting uncomfortable truths about human nature and social organization. Given proper conditions, ordinary people can systematize the most horrific behaviors and transmit them across generations as cultural traditions. Isolation breeds its own moral framework, community loyalty can justify any atrocity, and institutional authority can be corrupted to protect any secret, no matter how monstrous. The persistence of the cover-up across nearly 150 years demonstrates that some secrets possess their own momentum, creating ongoing conspiracies that outlive their original participants. The same networks that protected the original killers continue protecting their descendants, not necessarily because current generation members are active predators, but because ex people OSHA would reveal institutional complicity that extends far beyond the original crimes. The psychological profile of investigators who got too close to the truth reveals another crucial pattern. These weren't conspiracy theorists or amateur detectives, but credentialed professionals working through legitimate channels with proper methodology. Their systematic elimination or discouragement suggests sophisticated threat assessment and neutralization capabilities that go far beyond local corruption into organized intelligence-level operations. The evolution from direct violence to institutional suppression shows how criminal enterprises can achieve permanence through adaptation. Rather than continuing crude frontier methods that became increasingly risky, these families learned to leverage legitimate power structures for protection. They became more dangerous over time because they became more sophisticated, not because they became less evil. The geographical advantages that initially enabled these operations remain relevant in understanding contemporary missing persons patterns. Remote areas still provide natural advantages for predators who understand how to exploit isolation, terrain, and community structures. The same factors that made the Ozark Hollows perfect killing zones continue creating similar opportunities wherever civilization's reach remains limited. Most disturbing is the realization that this case represents not historical curiosity, but ongoing reality. The institutional networks, psychological conditioning methods, and operational techniques revealed through investigating the Hargrove disappearance remain active today. The evil that consumed 2 educated men in 1879 didn't die with its original perpetrators. It evolved, adapted, and continues operating through their institutional and genetic descendants. Tonight, you've descended deeper into forbidden knowledge than most people will ever dare to go. You've seen behind the carefully constructed lies that pass for history, understood how organized evil operates across generations, and recognized that the comfortable myths about civilization and progress are deliberate deceptions designed to hide ongoing operations by predators who've learned to wear respectable masks. The Hargrove brothers died because they saw too much, knew too much, and represented too great a threat to secrets that certain families had killed to protect for generations. Their fate demonstrates what happens to anyone who gets close enough to the truth to threaten established power structures. They become examples, warnings to others who might consider similar investigations into areas that are supposed to remain hidden. But their story also reveals something else. The truth has its own power, its own persistence, its own ability to surface despite systematic suppression. Evidence keeps emerging. Documents survive destruction attempts. Confessions eventually come to light. The harder evil works to hide itself, the more obvious its operations become to anyone willing to look beneath surface narratives. You now understand that the world operates according to rules very different from those you were taught in school, church, or by mainstream media. You've learned that institutional authority often serves to protect rather than prosecute evil, that respectable families can harbor monstrous secrets, and that isolation provides cover for activities that would horrify anyone who discovered them. This knowledge comes with responsibility. You can't unknow what you've learned tonight. You can't return to comfortable ignorance about human nature and social organization. You've crossed a line that separates those who accept official narratives from those who understand the deeper realities of how power operates and protects itself. The question now becomes what you do with this knowledge. Do you continue descending deeper into rabbit holes that reveal even more disturbing truths? Do you begin recognizing similar patterns in contemporary cases that mainstream media refuses to investigate properly? Do you start questioning other official narratives that might be hiding comparable secrets? Remember that phrase I asked you to comment earlier? The hollow knows. It means more than just acknowledgement of what happened to the Hargrove brothers. It means recognition that you've joined a community of people who understand that darkness operates in plain sight, protected by networks of power that span generations and institutions. You've become someone who knows that monsters exist, and they're not hiding in shadows. They're wearing suits, holding office, and making sure inconvenient truths stay buried. The Hollow knows what happened to Thomas and William Hargrove, and now, so do you. The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge? Because once you've seen this deep into how the world really works, you can never go back to believing comfortable lies. You've become someone who knows the truth, and that makes you dangerous to people who've spent 150 years making sure this story stayed hidden. Welcome to the other side of history. Welcome to the truth. The Hargrove case wasn't an isolated incident in American history. It was part of a broader pattern of systematic predation that operated across the frontier wherever isolation provided cover and corruption provided protection. What you've learned tonight represents just one documented example of operations that stretched from the Appalachians to the Rockies, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast, anywhere families could establish territories beyond the effective reach of civilized authority. Between 1850 and 1900, over 3,000 travelers were reported missing in remote areas across the American frontier. Official records attributed these disappearances to natural hazards, animal attacks, or simple misadventure. But when you examine the patterns, the clustering around specific properties, the seasonal timing, the demographic profiles of victims, a different picture emerges. These weren't random tragedies, but systematic harvesting operations conducted by families who had perfected predation into a science. The Bender family in Kansas operated an inn where guests regularly disappeared between 1871 and 1873. When authorities finally investigated, they found trapdoors, hidden chambers, and evidence that at least 11 people had been murdered and butchered on the property. The Benders vanished before they could be arrested, but their methodology, luring travelers to isolated locations, killing them systematically, and disposing of remains to prevent identification, matched patterns found across dozens of similar operations. The Bloody Harps in Kentucky and Tennessee murdered over 40 people between 1797 and 1804, developing techniques for ambushing travelers that would be copied by criminal families for generations. The Bean clan in Scotland had practiced similar methods for decades before some members emigrated to America, bringing their expertise in human predation to frontier territories where such skills could be employed with minimal risk of prosecution. These weren't independent operations, but interconnected networks that shared information, techniques, and sometimes victims. Families like the Holloways didn't develop their methods in isolation. They learned from others who had perfected similar systems, adapted those techniques to local conditions, and passed the knowledge to descendants who continued refining the operations across generations. The mineral exploration that brought the Hargrove brothers to their doom wasn't coincidental timing. It was targeted opportunity. Criminal families had learned to monitor geological surveys, mining expeditions, and land speculation activities because such vented Pumbatuin. Uras brought wealthy, educated victims to remote locations where they could be eliminated without immediate investigation. The brothers weren't just wrong place, wrong time. They were specifically selected prey. Understanding this broader context reveals that what happened in those Ozark hollows represents American history that's been systematically erased from official records, academic curricula, and popular consciousness. The frontier wasn't just dangerous due to natural hazards, it was deliberately made dangerous by organized predators who had learned to use isolation and institutional corruption to create hunting preserves for human prey. The methodology these families employed reveals sophisticated understanding of human psychology, group dynamics, and operational security that goes far beyond crude criminal activity. They had developed systems for identifying suitable victims, isolating them from potential help, manipulating their psychology to ensure cooperation, and eliminating them in ways that minimized risk of detection or retaliation. Target selection followed specific criteria designed to reduce investigative risk while maximizing operational benefit. Victims had to be wealthy enough to make their elimination worthwhile, but isolated enough that their disappearance wouldn't trigger immediate professional investigation. They needed to be strangers to local communities, but not so obviously foreign that their presence would be remembered by multiple witnesses. The Hargrove brothers fit this profile perfectly: prosperous, educated, but operating alone in unfamiliar territory. Psychological manipulation began from first contact, with families like the Holloways presenting themselves as helpful locals, offering assistance to travelers in distress. This established debt relationships that made victims psychologically dependent on their eventual killers, creating cognitive dissonance that prevented recognition of danger signals until too late. William Hargrove's enthusiasm about mineral discovery wasn't accidental. It was carefully cultivated through calculated revelation of tantalizing possibilities. The separation technique used on the brothers, keeping Thomas isolated while William was shown opportunities, prevented victim cooperation, and enabled individual psychological control. Divide and conquer wasn't just tactical advantage, but psychological necessity, allowing manipulators to work on each victim separately while preventing them from reinforcing each other's survival instincts or escape planning. Physical isolation was enhanced through seasonal timing that made escape attempts impractical even if victims recognized their danger. Winter conditions in remote territories meant that fleeing the homestead could be more dangerous than remaining, creating psychological prisons that were more effective than physical restraints. Victims became complicit in their own captivity through rational calculation of survival odds. The ritualistic aspects of the killings served multiple psychological functions beyond simple elimination. The ceremonial elements reinforced group bonding among family members, created traumatic conditioning that ensured silence from younger participants, and established psychological dominance that prevented victim resistance during the killing process. The victims weren't just murdered, they were psychologically destroyed before physical elimination began. Documentation and evidence management followed protocols designed to prevent investigation while maintaining operational records for future reference. The families kept detailed accounts of victims, methodologies, and disposal techniques, but stored these records in ways that would be destroyed if discovery threatened. This allowed operational refinement across time while maintaining plausible deniability if authorities became suspicious. The network effects that enabled these operations reveal how criminal enterprises can achieve institutional legitimacy through strategic relationship building and generational planning. The families involved weren't operating in isolation. They were part of interconnected systems that provided mutual support, shared intelligence, and coordinated responses to external threats. Marriage alliances between criminal families served multiple operational purposes beyond simple genetic diversification. These relationships created communication networks that allowed rapid information sharing about potential threats, suitable victims, and law enforcement activities. When the Hargrove investigation began, multiple families across several counties would have been alerted within days, allowing coordinated response that ensured consistent testimony and evidence management. Economic integration with legitimate businesses provided both cover and operational support for predatory activities. Criminal families often controlled local trading posts, boarding houses, and transportation services, creating infrastructure that could be used to identify and isolate potential victims while maintaining facades of respectable commerce. The Holloways' apparent prosperity despite poor farming conditions suggests participation in such integrated operations. Religious and social institution infiltration allowed these families to monitor community activities and identify threats before they could develop into serious investigations. Church membership, participation in local government, and involvement in social organizations provided early warning systems that alerted criminal networks to outside interest in their activities. This integration also provided character references that could be used to deflect suspicion during investigations. Law enforcement corruption wasn't achieved through simple bribery, but through systematic relationship building that created mutual dependency between criminal families and official authority ties. Sheriffs who accepted protection money became complicit in ongoing operations, making them unable to investigate seriously without risking their own exposure. This created self-reinforcing systems where corruption deepened over time rather than being resolved through personnel changes. Political influence operated through multiple channels designed to ensure protection regardless of electoral outcomes. Criminal families supported multiple candidates in local elections, providing financial backing and voter mobilization in exchange for policy commitments. This hedging strategy meant that, regardless of who won office, the families maintained influence over law enforcement and judicial activities in their territories. The generational transmission of these networks required sophisticated training programs that indoctrinated children into operational roles while maintaining psychological stability necessary for integration with mainstream society. Young family members had to learn which secrets required absolute protection, which authorities could be trusted, and which methods should be used to eliminate threats, all while developing personalities capable of normal social interaction when necessary. The technological evolution of these criminal enterprises demonstrates remarkable adaptability as families learn to leverage new capabilities for enhanced operational effectiveness. The introduction of telegraph communications, railroad transportation, and improved firearms didn't eliminate these operations. It forced them to become more sophisticated in their methods and more careful in their target selection. Telegraph networks that connected previously isolated communities to broader communication systems created both opportunities and vulnerabilities for criminal families. While telegraphs could bring unwanted attention from outside authorities, they also provided advance warning about potential investigations and allowed rapid coordination between criminal networks across wider geographical areas. Families learned to monitor telegraph traffic and sometimes gained access to communications through corruption of local operators. Railroad expansion changed victim demographics by bringing different types of travelers through previously isolated territories. Wealthy passengers traveling by rail represented lucrative targets, but railroad companies had economic incentives to investigate disappearances that might affect their business. Criminal families adapted by developing techniques for intercepting travelers between stations, creating incidents that appeared to occur away from railroad property to avoid corporate investigation. Improved firearms technology made individual victims more dangerous, but also provided criminal families with better tools for control and elimination. The psychological impact of superior weapons could be used to ensure victim compliance during initial stages of operations, while improved accuracy and reliability reduced risks during elimination phases. Families invested in the latest weapons technology as essential business equipment. Photography and detailed record-keeping systems created new evidence management challenges for criminal operations. While these technologies could potentially expose operations through documentation, they also provided new tools for victim identification and operational planning. Criminal families learned to avoid photographic documentation while using improved record-keeping methods to refine their techniques. Banking systems and improved currency exchange mechanisms changed how criminal families could benefit from their operations. Rather than being limited to physical goods taken from victims, families could now convert stolen assets into negotiable instruments that could be used for investment in legitimate businesses or relocation to new territories if local operations became too risky. Legal system improvements, including better communication between jurisdictions and more systematic evidence management, required criminal families to develop more sophisticated methods for avoiding detection and prosecution. This drove evolution toward corruption-based protection rather than simple avoidance of authorities, as legal systems became too efficient to evade through purely operational means. The psychological conditioning systems used to maintain these operations across generations reveals sophisticated understanding of trauma-based programming that wouldn't be formally recognized by academic psychology until decades later. The families involved had developed empirical methods for creating functional personalities capable of extreme violence while maintaining facades of normalcy necessary for community integration. Childhood indoctrination began with exposure to ritualized violence presented as family tradition and community necessity. Young family members were gradually introduced to increasingly disturbing activities, starting with observation of animal slaughter and progressing through stages that normalized human predation as acceptable behavior under specific circumstances. This progression prevented trauma responses that might have created psychological instability or moral resistance. Compartmentalization training taught children to separate their understanding of family activities from their interactions with outside authorities and community members. They learned to maintain different personality presentations for different audiences, developing natural acting abilities that allowed them to appear normal in social situations while participating in systematic murder when family operations required their involvement. Loyalty programming used combination of reward and punishment systems to ensure absolute commitment to family operations, regardless of external pressures. Children who demonstrated proper understanding of operational requirements received privileges and advancement within family hierarchies, while those who showed signs of moral resistance faced isolation, punishment, or elimination if they became serious security risks. Trauma bonding techniques created psychological dependency, relationships between family members that prevented defection or cooperation with outside authorities. Shared participation in violent activities created mutual culpability that made exposure dangerous for all participants, ensuring group loyalty through collective vulnerability rather than simple fear or affection. Religious and ideological justification systems provided philosophical frameworks that rationalized criminal activities as morally acceptable or even necessary. Families developed belief systems that designated outsiders as legitimate prey, presented their activities as natural predation rather than murder, and created sense of superiority over victims who were portrayed as weak or deserving of their fate. Intelligence gathering and counter-surveillance training prepared family members to identify potential threats from law enforcement or outside investigators while avoiding behaviors that might attract unwanted attention. This included instruction in recognizing surveillance techniques, maintaining operational security, and eliminating evidence before it could be discovered by hostile authorities. The success of these programming methods is evident in the multi-generational persistence of criminal operations and the consistent loyalty demonstrated by family members, even when facing serious legal consequences. The psychological conditioning was so effective that it created genuine believers rather than simply coerced participants, ensuring operational continuity across decades of potential exposure and investigation. The institutional evolution that protected these operations reveals how criminal enterprises can achieve legitimacy through systematic infiltration of power structures over multiple generations. What began as crude frontier violence evolved into sophisticated corruption networks that wielded influence at state and federal levels, demonstrating that organized evil becomes more dangerous as it becomes more respectable. Educational institution penetration began with placing family members in teaching positions at local schools, where they could influence curriculum development and identify potential threats among young people who might grow up to investigate family operations. Teachers who understood which topics required careful handling could guide student research away from dangerous areas while appearing to provide normal education. Legal profession infiltration allowed criminal families to place members in positions where they could influence prosecution decisions, manipulate evidence management, and ensure favorable outcomes in legal proceedings that might threaten family operations. Judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys who understood family interests could coordinate activities to protect ongoing operations while maintaining facades of proper legal procedure. Medical profession corruption provided criminal families with capabilities for evidence management that went far beyond simple disposal of remains. Doctors who understood operational requirements could falsify death certificates, provide false testimony about cause of death, and ensure that forensic evidence was interpreted in ways that protected family interests rather than revealing criminal activity. Business community integration created economic networks that provided both operational support and political influence for criminal families. Legitimate businesses could be used to launder proceeds from criminal activities, provide employment for family members who needed respectable covers, and generate economic influence that could be converted into political protection when necessary. Religious institution infiltration allowed criminal families to influence moral authority in their communities while gaining access to confession information that might reveal threats to their operations. Ministers who understood family interests could guide community moral development in directions that supported, rather than challenged, ongoing criminal activities. Military and law enforcement career placement provided criminal families with access to weapons, training, and intelligence capabilities that enhanced their operational effectiveness while providing institutional protection from investigation. Family members with military or police backgrounds brought professional skills to criminal operations while using their official positions to deflect suspicion and manipulate investigations. The culmination of this institutional infiltration was the creation of protection networks that operated at multiple levels of government and society, ensuring that criminal families could maintain their operations regardless of personnel changes or political developments. By the time serious investigations might have been possible, too many institutions had been compromised to allow effective prosecution. Comment: The Hollow Nose again. If you understand that what you're learning tonight isn't just historical curiosity, but operational intelligence about systems that continue functioning today. This phrase marks you as someone who recognizes that the same networks, methodologies, and institutional corruption revealed through the Hargrove case remain active in contemporary society, adapted to modern conditions, but maintaining their essential character and objectives. The evolution from frontier murder operations to modern organized crime demonstrates continuity of methods rather than fundamental change in objectives. Contemporary missing persons cases in rural areas often follow patterns remarkably similar to those established by families like the Holloways, clustering around specific properties, investigations that face unusual resistance, evidence that disappears through administrative errors, and witnesses who change testimony or refuse cooperation entirely. Modern human trafficking operations use psychological manipulation techniques that directly descend from methods developed by criminal families in the 19th century. The same approaches used to control the Hargrove brothers, isolation, dependency creation, psychological manipulation, and systematic elimination of escape options, appear in contemporary cases involving forced labor, sexual exploitation, and organ harvesting operations. Institutional protection mechanisms revealed in the Hargrove case provide templates for understanding how modern criminal enterprises achieve legitimacy and protection. Academic research suppression, evidence management through bureaucratic channels, investigator intimidation through career destruction, and media manipulation all represent evolved versions of techniques that proved effective in protecting frontier murder operations. The geographical advantages that enabled historical operations remain relevant for contemporary criminal activities. Remote properties in areas with limited law enforcement coverage continue providing ideal locations for activities that require isolation from potential witnesses or intervention. The same terrain features that made Ozark Hollows perfect for systematic murder continue creating similar opportunities wherever isolation provides operational advantages. Financial networks developed by criminal families to manage proceeds from their operations evolved into sophisticated money laundering systems that serve modern organized crime. The techniques for converting stolen assets into legitimate investments, developed by families like the Holloways, provided foundations for contemporary financial crime that operates through multiple jurisdictions and legitimate business fronts. Political corruption methods established by frontier criminal families continue functioning in modern contexts where campaign contributions, lobbying activities, and strategic relationship building provide similar protection from investigation and prosecution. The same families that learned to control local sheriffs now influence prosecutors, judges, and legislators through more sophisticated but essentially identical corruption techniques. Understanding these connections requires recognizing that organized evil doesn't disappear with changing technology or social conditions. It adapts, evolves, and continues operating through whatever systems provide the most effective protection and operational capability in contemporary environments. The modern descendants of these criminal families haven't abandoned their ancestors' methodologies. They've refined them for contemporary conditions while maintaining the same fundamental objectives, identifying and eliminating threats while maximizing operational benefit through systematic predation. Today's operations use different tools but follow identical strategic principles that proved effective across multiple generations. Corporate structures provide modern criminal families with legitimacy and protection that frontier operations could never achieve. Holding companies, shell corporations, and complex ownership arrangements allow contemporary operations to function through seemingly legitimate businesses while maintaining the same compartmentalization and deniability that protected historical criminal activities. The victims may be different, but the fundamental predation continues. Digital surveillance capabilities have replaced the crude intelligence-gathering methods used by families like the Holloways, but serve identical purposes. Identifying potential threats before they can develop into serious investigations, monitoring law enforcement activities, and maintaining operational security through early warning systems. Modern criminal families use technology to achieve the same objectives their ancestors pursued through corruption of telegraph operators and postal workers. Legal system manipulation has evolved from simple sheriff corruption into sophisticated influence operations involving multiple levels of government, regulatory agencies, and judicial systems. Contemporary criminal families don't need to threaten individual prosecutors. They can achieve the same objectives through campaign contributions, lobbying activities, and strategic placement of family members in positions where they can influence policy development and enforcement priorities. Media control provides modern criminal enterprises with capabilities for narrative management that historical operations could never achieve. Rather than simply suppressing individual investigations, contemporary criminal families can shape public perception through ownership of media, outlets, strategic advertising relationships, and coordinated information campaigns that discredit investigators before they can present their findings. Academic institution infiltration continues serving the same functions it provided for historical criminal families, controlling research agendas, suppressing inconvenient findings, and ensuring that educational curricula don't prepare students to recognize or investigate organized criminal activities. The destruction of Michael Garfield's research represents a pattern that continues today through more sophisticated but equally effective academic suppression methods. International operations allow modern criminal families to avoid geographical constraints that limited historical operations. When local conditions become unfavorable, contemporary criminal enterprises can relocate operations to jurisdictions with more favorable corruption environments, maintaining operational continuity while avoiding accountability for historical activities. The same families that once operated in isolated hollows now function across multiple countries through networks that provide similar protection and operational capability. The psychological profile of modern criminal family members reveals how successfully historical programming methods have been transmitted across generations, creating individuals who appear completely normal in social situations while maintaining capability for extreme violence when operational requirements demand such activities. These aren't obviously disturbed individuals. They're functional members of society who've inherited both the methodologies and the psychological conditioning necessary for systematic predation. Professional integration allows contemporary criminal family members to occupy positions in law enforcement, government, academia, and business, where they can serve family interests while maintaining facades of legitimate career development. A prosecutor who happens to be descended from the Holloway family might genuinely believe in justice while unconsciously ensuring that investigations never reach conclusions that might threaten inherited operations. Social camouflage has become sophisticated enough that criminal family members can participate in community activities, charitable organizations, and religious institutions without creating suspicion about their true loyalties or activities. The same psychological compartmentalization that allowed historical family members to appear normal while participating in ritual murder continues functioning in contemporary contexts. Generational knowledge transfer ensures that operational expertise developed over decades of criminal activity doesn't disappear when older family members die or retire from active participation. Contemporary family members inherit not just financial assets, but technical knowledge, strategic understanding, and relationship networks that provide continuing operational advantages across multiple generations. Adaptive capabilities demonstrated by these families across historical periods suggest that contemporary operations may be more dangerous than historical activities because they combine traditional predatory instincts with modern technology, financial resources, and institutional protection. The same families that learned to survive frontier conditions have proven equally capable of thriving in modern environments. Risk assessment and threat management have evolved from crude elimination of problematic individuals into sophisticated operations that can destroy careers, manipulate legal proceedings, and discredit investigators without creating obvious connections to criminal family interests. Modern threat elimination may be more subtle than historical methods, but it's equally effective at protecting ongoing operations. Recruitment and expansion strategies allow contemporary criminal families to incorporate new members who aren't genetically related but share compatible psychological profiles and operational capabilities. This expansion beyond blood relationships provides operational flexibility while maintaining the loyalty and security characteristics that ensured historical survival across multiple generations. The success of psychological programming methods is evident in the continued operational security maintained by these families despite multiple investigations, academic research projects, and media attention. The same conditioning techniques that prevented defection in frontier conditions continue ensuring loyalty and silence among contemporary family members facing modern investigative pressures. The technological sophistication of modern operations represents evolution rather than abandonment of historical methodologies. Contemporary criminal families use digital communications, financial networks, and surveillance systems to achieve the same objectives their ancestors pursued through crude frontier methods: identifying suitable victims, isolating them from potential help, eliminating threats to ongoing operations, and maintaining community control necessary for long-term survival. Cryptocurrency and digital payment systems provide contemporary criminal families with capabilities for asset management and transaction processing that eliminate many of the evidence trails that historical operations couldn't avoid. Victims can be robbed through digital means that leave no physical evidence, while proceeds can be laundered through networks that span multiple jurisdictions and regulatory environments. Social media platforms serve modern criminal families as intelligence-gathering tools that provide detailed information about potential victims, their travel plans, financial resources, and social connections. The same families that once relied on physical surveillance and community informants now harvest information from digital sources that victims voluntarily provide through their online activities. GPS tracking and mobile communications allow contemporary criminal families to monitor potential threats with precision that historical operations could never achieve. Investigators can be tracked continuously, their communications monitored, and their activities predicted through digital surveillance that operates without their knowledge or consent. Legal database access through family members, placed in law enforcement and judicial positions, provides contemporary criminal families with early warning about investigations, prosecutions, and regulatory activities that might threaten ongoing operations. The same corruption that once involved bribing local sheriffs now operates through legitimate career placement that provides superior intelligence capabilities. Corporate ownership structures allow modern criminal families to control legitimate businesses that can be used for money laundering, victim identification, and operational support, while maintaining complete legal separation between criminal activities and business operations. Historical criminal families could only dream of the protection and operational capability that contemporary corporate structures provide. International banking systems enable contemporary criminal families to operate across multiple jurisdictions while avoiding accountability in any single legal system. Proceeds from criminal activities can be moved rapidly between countries, invested in legitimate businesses, and converted into political influence that provides protection from investigation or prosecution. The integration of technology with traditional criminal methodologies has created hybrid operations that combine the predatory effectiveness of provide. Contemporary criminal families aren't abandoning their ancestors' techniques, they're enhancing them through technological multiplication of traditional capabilities. The institutional capture achieved by contemporary descendants of these criminal families extends far beyond anything their historical predecessors could have imagined. Modern operations don't just corrupt individual officials, they shape entire policy frameworks, regulatory environments, and cultural narratives to create conditions where systematic predation can operate under legal protection while appearing to serve legitimate social functions. Educational curriculum development allows criminal families to influence what multiple generations learn about history, psychology, and social organization. By controlling textbook adoption processes, funding educational research, and placing family members in key academic positions, contemporary criminal enterprises can ensure that students never learn to recognize the patterns and methodologies that might expose ongoing operations. Media ownership concentration provides criminal families with capabilities for narrative control that operate at national and international levels. Rather than simply suppressing individual news stories, contemporary criminal enterprises can shape public understanding of entire topics, ensuring that systematic predation appears to be isolated criminal activity rather than organized enterprise with historical roots and continuing operations. Regulatory capture allows criminal families to influence the development and enforcement of laws that might affect their operations. Through strategic campaign contributions, lobbying activities, and placement of family members in regulatory agencies, contemporary criminal enterprises can ensure that legal frameworks serve their interests while appearing to protect public welfare. Judicial system influence operates through multiple channels that provide contemporary criminal families with protection that historical operations could never achieve. Strategic political contributions affect judicial appointments, while professional relationships and financial dependencies ensure that judges understand which interests require protection, regardless of legal technicalities or evidence presented. Law enforcement penetration has evolved from simple corruption of individual sheriffs into systematic influence over entire agencies through career advancement manipulation, budget control, and policy development. Contemporary criminal families don't need to bribe individual officers. They can achieve better results through institutional control that shapes agency priorities and operational procedures. Intelligence community relationships provide criminal families with access to surveillance capabilities, information resources, and operational protection that eliminate most risks of exposure or prosecution. Family members with intelligence backgrounds bring professional capabilities to criminal operations while using official positions to deflect investigation and manipulate evidence. The sophistication of modern institutional capture means that criminal families can operate with near-complete impunity while appearing to be legitimate participants in social, economic, and political systems. They've achieved the ultimate camouflage, becoming indistinguishable from legitimate authority while maintaining all the predatory capabilities that characterize their historical operations. The global expansion of these criminal networks represents the logical evolution of families that learn to survive and prosper through systematic predation across multiple generations. Contemporary operations aren't limited by geographical boundaries that constrained historical activity. They function through international networks that provide unprecedented operational capability and protection from accountability. Human trafficking operations managed by descendants of historical criminal families utilize the same psychological manipulation techniques that proved effective in frontier conditions, adapted for modern logistics and communication systems. Victims are still isolated from potential help, psychologically conditioned for compliance, and systematically exploited through methods that descend directly from historical predation techniques. Organ harvesting networks, operated by contemporary criminal families, represent evolution of the systematic butchery that characterized historical operations like those conducted by the Holloways. Modern medical technology allows more sophisticated utilization of human remains for profit, while international transportation systems enable global distribution of harvested materials to markets that pay premium prices for anonymously sourced organs. Financial crime operations utilize techniques for asset conversion and money laundering that evolved from methods developed by historical criminal families for managing proceeds from their predatory activities. Contemporary operations can process vastly larger amounts of stolen assets through legitimate financial systems while maintaining the same compartmentalization and deniability that protected historical criminal enterprises. Political influence operations conducted by modern criminal families utilize relationship building and corruption techniques that proved effective in frontier conditions, scaled up to operate at national and international levels. The same families that learned to control local law enforcement now influence foreign policy, military operations, and international treaty development through strategic placement and financial manipulation. Corporate espionage and intellectual property theft represent modern applications of intelligence-gathering techniques that historical criminal families developed for identifying and monitoring potential threats to their operations. Contemporary criminal enterprises can steal technological innovations, business strategies, and research findings that provide competitive advantages worth billions of dollars. Cyber warfare capabilities allow contemporary criminal families to conduct operations against targets anywhere in the world without physical presence or obvious connection to criminal activities. Digital attacks can destroy evidence, manipulate communications, and eliminate threats through methods that leave no trace connecting to the families responsible for ordering such operations. The integration of traditional criminal methodologies with modern technology and global networks has created criminal enterprises that combine the predatory effectiveness of historical operations with capabilities that their ancestors couldn't have imagined. These aren't new criminals. They're evolved versions of the same families that have been perfecting systematic predation for over 150 years. The ultimate revelation about cases like the Hargrove brothers isn't just what happened to two men in 1879, but what their fate reveals about the true nature of power, authority, and social organization. Their story demonstrates that the institutions most people trust for protection, law enforcement, government, academia, religious organizations, can be corrupted to serve the interests of systematic predators rather than their intended beneficiaries. Understanding this case requires accepting that civilization itself may be more fragile than most people believe, maintained not through inherent human goodness or effective institutional protection, but through the temporary inability of organized evil to completely capture and control all protective mechanisms simultaneously. The Hargrove case shows what happens when that capture becomes sufficiently comprehensive to operate with impunity. The psychological impact of recognizing these truths creates cognitive dissonance that most people resolve by rejecting the evidence rather than accepting implications that would require fundamental revision of their understanding of society and human nature. This psychological resistance provides additional protection for criminal operations by ensuring that even when evidence becomes available, most people will refuse to acknowledge its implications. Moral frameworks that most people use to understand criminal behavior become inadequate when confronting systematic predation that operates across generations through inherited traditions and institutional protection. The Hargrove case reveals evil that exists outside normal categories of crime and punishment, requiring recognition that some forms of human behavior can't be addressed through conventional legal or social remedies. Historical narratives that present progress as inevitable and civilization as advancing toward greater justice and protection serve the interests of criminal families by discouraging investigation of contemporary operations that might reveal continuing predation. The comfortable myth of historical progress prevents recognition that the same evil that consumed the Hargrove brothers continues operating today through evolved methods. Individual agency becomes questionable when recognizing the extent of institutional capture and systematic manipulation revealed through cases like the Hargrove disappearance. People who discover these truths face the disturbing realization that their ability to pursue justice or protect themselves may be severely limited by corruption networks that extend far beyond their ability to combat or avoid. Collective responsibility emerges as the only effective response to systematic predation that operates through institutional capture, but requires levels of coordination and commitment that may be impossible to achieve, given the psychological resistance most people demonstrate when confronted with evidence that challenges their fundamental assumptions about society and human nature. The Hargrove case ultimately reveals that the choice isn't between good and evil in any simple sense, but between comfortable illusion and disturbing truth, between maintaining psychological stability through willful ignorance and accepting responsibility that comes with knowledge that can't be unknown once acquired. The personal transformation that occurs when someone truly understands cases like the Hargrove brothers creates permanent changes in how they perceive society, evaluate information, and make decisions about trust and cooperation. You can't return to naive faith in institutional protection once you've seen how thoroughly those institutions can be corrupted to serve the interests of systematic predators rather than the people they're supposed to protect. Paranoid awareness becomes rational response when recognizing that the same networks revealed through historical cases like the Hargrove disappearance continue operating today through evolved methods that may be more sophisticated but serve identical objectives. The psychological comfort of trusting authority becomes luxury that informed people can't afford once they understand how authority can be captured and used against its supposed beneficiaries, information evaluation requires different criteria when understanding that academic research, media reporting, and official investigations may be deliberately manipulated to serve the interests of criminal enterprises rather than revealing truth. Evidence must be assessed not just for accuracy, but for what it reveals about the motivations and loyalties of those presenting it, creating epistemological challenges that most people prefer to avoid. Relationship assessment becomes more complex when recognizing that people who appear completely normal may be connected to criminal networks through family relationships, professional obligations, or financial dependencies that create conflicts between their personal inclinations and their operational loyalties. Trust becomes conditional rather than automatic, requiring ongoing evaluation rather than initial judgment. Career decisions take on different implications when understanding that certain professions, institutions, and geographical areas may provide greater exposure to systematic predation or corruption networks that could compromise personal safety or moral integrity. Knowledge about cases like the Hargrove brothers creates responsibilities that affect practical life choices in ways that innocent people never need to consider. Social isolation often results from acquiring knowledge that most people refuse to accept, creating psychological burdens that can only be shared with others who have undergone similar transformation. The community of people who understand these truths becomes both support network and potential security risk, as criminal families monitor and sometimes infiltrate groups that demonstrate dangerous awareness. Operational security becomes necessary consideration for anyone who develops serious understanding of how systematic predation operates and protects itself. The same families that eliminated the Hargrove brothers continue using evolved methods to neutralize contemporary threats, requiring informed people to develop capabilities for protecting themselves and their information from hostile surveillance and intervention. The burden of knowledge creates ethical obligations that most people never face, including decisions about what information to share with others, how to protect sources and evidence, and whether to pursue investigations that might expose criminal operations while creating personal danger for investigators and their families. Tonight, you've completed a journey that most people will never dare to take. You've descended through layers of comfortable deception to reach truths that exist in the spaces between official narratives and sanitized histories. You've learned that the world operates according to rules very different from those taught in schools, preached in churches, or promoted through media that serves interests you're now beginning to understand. The Hargrove brothers died because they represented everything that systematic predators fear: educated outsiders with legitimate authority, powerful connections, and the technical capability to document what they discovered. Their fate demonstrates what happens to anyone who gets close enough to certain truths to threaten operations that have been perfected across multiple generations by families who understand that survival requires absolute ruthlessness in protecting their secrets. But their story also reveals something else. Truth has its own power, its own persistence, its own ability to surface despite systematic suppression by networks that control institutions, manipulate evidence, and eliminate threats through methods that range from career destruction to permanent silence. The harder evil works to hide itself, the more obvious its operations become to anyone willing to look beneath surface narratives and comfortable lies. You now possess knowledge that comes with both power and responsibility. You understand that the instituti bonds most people trust for protection can be corrupted to serve the interests of systematic predators. You recognize that comfortable myths about civilization and progress serve to conceal ongoing operations by criminal families who have learned to wear respectable masks while maintaining their fundamental nature as human predators. This knowledge makes you dangerous to people who have spent over 150 years ensuring that stories like the Hargrove case remain hidden in archives, buried in bureaucratic files, or dismissed as historical curiosities irrelevant to contemporary concerns. You've become someone who can recognize patterns, connect evidence across time periods, and understand that what happened in those Ozark hollows represents ongoing reality rather than resolved history. The question now becomes what you do with this knowledge. Do you continue investigating similar cases that reveal the same patterns of systematic predation protected through institutional corruption? Do you begin recognizing how contemporary disappearances, accidents, and suicides might represent modern applications of methodologies perfected by families like the Holloways? Do you start questioning other official narratives that might be hiding comparable operations? Remember that you commented "the Hollow knows" twice during this journey, marking yourself as someone who understands that darkness operates in plain sight, protected by networks of corruption that span generations and institutions. That phrase connects you to a community of people who have learned to see past comfortable deceptions, to recognize the predators who walk among us, wearing masks of respectability and authority. The Hollow knows what happened to Thomas and William Hargrove. It knows what happened to thousands of others whose disappearances were attributed to natural hazards, criminal mishap, or simple misfortune. It knows because it remembers, because it keeps records, because it understands that forgetting history means repeating it under different names with evolved methodologies but identical objectives. You now know too, and that knowledge makes you part of something larger than yourself. The continuing resistance against systematic evil that has learned to corrupt every institution designed to protect innocent people from predators who understand that isolation breeds opportunity and corruption provides protection. Welcome to the truth. Welcome to the responsibility that comes with seeing clearly. Welcome to the understanding that civilization is more fragile than most people believe, maintained not through inherent human goodness, but through the vigilance of those who refuse to look away from uncomfortable evidence about what human beings become when proper constraints are removed. The Hargrove brothers couldn't be saved, but their story can still serve its purpose, warning others about dangers that exist in spaces between official protection and actual safety, between institutional authority and genuine justice, between comfortable lies and disturbing truths that demand action from those who acquire the knowledge and the courage to use it. The Hollow remembers, and now you remember too. The question is, what are you going to do about it?